my pleasure to welcome you to this event. As some of you have been to some of these events last year, this is an ongoing series I started last year to try to highlight some of the scholars we have both at our own university as well as scholars outside of this university on issues related to student engagement. And it's, as I say, I'm really tickled pink that Brent MacLaine here has agreed to give a talk as part of this series. As many of you know, Brent has been a scholar and a gentleman, for many years, both at this university as well as universities elsewhere in the world, including China and Singapore. He's won a number of awards, including probably most notably the 3M, but not just the 3M, there's the AAU award and others that go along with it. And I think all of that just goes to show that not only has he done wonderful work in terms of teaching the pedagogy of instruction, but he's been recognized by others in the field, both here regionally as well as nationally and internationally, for the work that he's done. I want to just point out one thing that I think some of you may have seen on the blurb advertising this talk, and that is Brent is a poet and scholar of 20th century literature. He's authored 4 volumes of poetry, including the Shades of Green, published by Acorn in 2008, which won both the Atlantic Poetry Prize and the Prince Edward Island Book Award. I should tell you as well, and you'll see the title of Brent's talk here, I'll tell you as well that unfortunately I have to leave here because there's another meeting I have to go to downtown that starts at 4:30, or excuse me, at 4 o'clock, and so I have to leave here at about 10 to 4 to get to that. Dean Desirut here has agreed to handle the Q&A afterwards, so if you see me slipping out, Brent, it has nothing whatsoever to do with the content of your talk. And with that as an introduction, Brent, I'll turn it over to you.
Understood. Thank you, Jim. That's good. Well, thank you very much for that and for the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts on this topic. And thank you all for coming out on what must be perhaps the chilliest winter day so far. I was a little hesitant when Jim asked me to do something for this series first, partly because I didn't know what I would talk about, student engagement. And I thought, well, I could describe some of the things that I do in my classrooms, but to a certain extent that would be repetitive. I do that piece in the Faculty Development Summer Institute, and I have given workshops on team-based learning elsewhere, and some of you have attended those. And so instead I went back to the moment where I made the shift, I think, in my own career, and I found my topic there. I see there's some people back there. There are some seats still here down front, so don't hesitate to. It's the first observation about a lecture. It's the reluctance to fill the front seats. That's right. And it went back to the mid 90s, I think, when I made what I think is a formative shift in my pedagogy. And it had to do with my experience of lecturing at that time, and I switched to a team-based learning approach. And it was serendipitous that one of the online discussion groups that I pay attention to is the one for the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, or STELI. And just within the past month, there's been a very robust exchange of posts on STELI regarding the lecture. And it was initiated by George MacDonald Ross, who is a senior lecturer in philosophy at Leeds University. And he posted an article which was entitled, What's the Use of Lectures 40 Years On? Now, his title refers to a previous title, which is What's the Use of Lectures, by Donald Bly, and that was a book that was published in 1971. Bly, in that first book, 1971, decided to survey all of the research that he could find on the lecture, which was research in both the US and Britain. And I was surprised to read when I looked at this book that there was so much of it, even in 1971. And there was a lot. And he very systematically, methodically, he analyzed and categorized the information that he found. The upshot of that was that he concluded that lecturing was adequate for disseminating information, although no better than other methods. But the lecturing was a failure when it came to the promotion of thought and changes in attitude. If that was the case, MacDonald Ross wondered, why is the lecture still prevailing and still such a prominent pedagogical force in the contemporary post-secondary institution? And the responses just flew past in the initial exchange. So before we get into that, however, I think there's a couple of preliminaries that I have to get out of the way. And the first preliminary is this one, is hypocrisy. Because, of course, if I'm going to critique the lecture, then you might wonder, how can I possibly hold up my head to give a lecture in which I do that? If a lecture is good enough to talk about lecturing, then surely it's good enough to talk about Hamlet or the molecular structure of the cell or whatever. Give me a little bit of wiggle room here, would you please? I do make some distinctions, and I think we all should, that there is a difference between a lecture and a presentation, such as a business presentation, a one-off presentation. There is a difference between an occasional lecture and a daily lecture, or a 3 times a week lecture. There's a difference between an uninterrupted lecture and an interactive lecture. And there's a difference between a lecture that models complex understanding of a topic and lecture used for disseminating information. So I think there are different genres of this, and I guess I'm addressing primarily the purest traditional form of the lecture, which is used more or less class in, class out for pedagogical purposes. So I'm not critiquing the Massey lectures, for example. And so my plan today is simply to share some of the findings that I have found as I looked into this topic, and I don't claim any great expertise in the research in this, but I did poke around in some information. And also some of my own thoughts that grow out of my experiences, and then the time that's left over, we'll have some questions and discussion. A little bit of history and some definitions first. You know that apparently the lecture goes back to the medieval period. As early as 1350, there's this illustration. And I like to imagine it this way, that there's a dusty library in some medieval university, perhaps a monastery. And a small group of scholars has gathered around to discuss the latest treatise, let's say on predestination. However, of course, this is the era before the printing press. There's only one copy of this treatise, and it's a well-thumbed manuscript. And the copyists have been busy with the gardening. They've left the scriptorium and haven't done their work to do the copying of the manuscript. So there's only one. But so how can a discussion of this important treatise take place, since none of the other scholars will have read it? Well, they decide that they will ask, say, Brother Giuseppe. He has a very pleasant reading voice. Perhaps you would read this treatise, and then we will listen to it, and then we can discuss it and debate it and dispute it. Over time, this reader of the manuscripts became known as the lecturer. And that is kind of the basis, is a reader. Essentially, the lecturer was a medieval photocopier when you think about it. It was giving us some information. I looked at this first and I thought, okay, there's a medieval illustration of a university. And then I looked at it more closely and I realized even in 1350, there are some problems with the lecture. Are these two flirting? You'll notice a conversation going on here. I also notice that, of course, the lecturer is in the highest position. He seems to have the biggest beard as well, and the biggest sort of headgear. Maybe that's another important feature of the lecturer. You also notice some are paying attention, some are not. Some have books, manuscripts, and others do not. How common is that for us? You'll notice this is full, and there are people over here. Is this the overflow of our crowded classrooms for lectures? Maybe this is the teaching assistant here, I don't know. And you can find other things in there. So it hasn't changed since 1350, apparently. The 19th century, 1822, this is William Hogarth, Scholars at a Lecture, appears to be equally as a good subject for parody. So if the original intention of the lecture is to read and disseminate information, that's fine. And I found it interesting that most of the studies that I looked at will sort of concede that point. So a lecture can deliver information, however, so can a textbook, a handout, a hot link, a video, a CD, a DVD, whether in the classroom, on Moodle, YouTube, an iPhone, iPad, Twitter, whatever. The researchers also say that the lecture is neither better nor worse than any of these, although these days we might well consider if it is less economical and convenient. Indeed, Graham Gibbs, one of the most outspoken critics of the lecture, says that there are indications that the lecturing is less effective even for imparting information than certain methods, most notably unsupervised reading. And that's from his article, 20 Terrible Reasons for Lecturing. Of course, defenders of the lecture will rightly claim that their lectures are much more complex and sophisticated than that, and surely a lecture can foster critical thinking and problem solving and something deeper than the surface learning of receiving information. Well, perhaps, but the literature that I've read is not encouraging. And while Ken Bain, in his book, What the Best College Teachers Do, agrees that in the hands of the most effective instructors, the lecture can clarify and simplify complex material while engaging important and challenging questions, he goes on to say that he found no great teachers who relied solely on lectures, not even highly gifted ones. So before we go farther down that road, however, there's some other definitions that I want to get to, particularly since this is related to the issue of engagement. Engagement, the more I thought about it, is a very rich word for teachers. And the obvious meaning that comes to mind is engagement in the sense of interesting. I think, however, that we need to go a lot further than that. We are interested in all kinds of things. I was very interested last week in the Australian Open, but I think I would hesitate to say that I was engaged by that. My attention may have been engaged in a sense of a diversion or entertainment, but I wasn't invested in it in any sort of educational sense. Now, someone from physical education could be engaged in that, or someone from some other discipline could certainly find engagement in that event. But I was merely pleasantly diverted and entertained. We could use the Nessie definition, which is the frequency with which students participate in activities that represent effective educational practices. I thought, well, yes, okay. It's the frequency with which. There seems to be an emphasis there on counting. And Nessie also claims to measure the ways in which institutions allocate resources and organizes learning opportunities and services. And I don't argue with that, but it seems to me that it's geared towards a more institutional kind of measure of engagement. I think we can get closer to the classroom with Elizabeth Barclay's definition, although the language still doesn't exactly excite me. A process and a product that is experienced on a continuum and results from a synergistic interaction between motivation and active learning. However, what caught my eye there, of course, was the word motivation and active learning. At least she is pointing us with the notion of engagement to those principles which I think are very important. Actually, I think if we just go to the good old-fashioned dictionary definition, there are some very interesting applications of the meaning of the word. So that's the entertaining aspect of the word engagement. But there's a Renaissance definition that I discovered about engagement, which was to pledge one's life or honor to expose to risk. We don't use that, but I like this idea that I'm pledging my life, my honor. We can use that you're pledging to learning. We want that kind of commitment, I think, when we speak of engagement. And also risk-taking, intellectual risk-taking. That's a kind of a neat idea to include in this idea of engagement. Of course, to engage is to bind by promise, by a legal or moral obligation. We would hope that our students become betrothed to learning and scholarship in our classrooms. Maybe that's what the X ring is all about, do you think? Maybe. Yeah. We engage people for work, to secure for use or hire for help. You think, well, yeah, it's kind of mechanical, but that reminds me that engagement does involve effort and application, and that too is very important for successful engagement in our classrooms. We engage a mechanism. You shift a lever, a gear to engage it to make it work. I like that aspect for classroom engagement because it throws an emphasis on the activation, the movement, that something has to happen in the engaged student. And finally, you engage in a conflict with opposition or a battle, and that too would work because for our intellectual engagement and growth, we need opposition. We need to bounce ideas off. We need to be challenged. We need debate that will improve our learning in the classroom. So those are some of the ideas I think that can be surrounding this idea of engagement. I suppose I'll be brave and add my own. I would like to add a much more personal aspect to this, that it's a personal, committed, invested encounter with questions of knowledge and meaning that matter to the learner's sense of a present and future self. And that's going to be very important, especially when we come to talk about what the dynamic of what happens in large classes and small classes and so on. At its best, this engagement is so intense that the professor and the modes or conditions of engagement become secondary to the experience of attempting to achieve learning goals. So I think it's that sort of total absorption and commitment of the self, so that this other surrounding material is, how it got there, it's not that important. Quick anecdote, I was coming up the stairs to my office in main building, and a student whom I knew well was in the lounge to the left, very close, and I was just about to say, hello. And then I realized he was in his bicycle gear, he had his feet up on the coffee table, and he had an old, ratty, yellowed-looking paperback book And he was totally absorbed in that book. He didn't even see me. And I didn't want to interrupt him. And what struck me about that was that the rest of the world surrounding him didn't matter. Right? I didn't matter. If it was a book or an iPad or a Kindle didn't matter. It was the idea and the engagement of what he was interested in at that particular moment was totally absorbing. It sounds a little bit sentimental, I suppose, or idealistic, but there's something deep at the personal level that I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about engagement. This will take about 7 minutes, but I think it's worthwhile listening to because it shows, I think, a conceptual shift that is rather interesting. The audio tape was of a professor, a U.S. professor, physics prof, who was alarmed, discovered that his first-year physics students, when they went on and were tested in second and third year, were failing. Then the failure rate was very high. And this was especially alarming because this physics professor, Mazur, I think was his name, was an especially gifted lecturer. He was an award-winning lecturer. His student ratings were top of the scale, and students flocked and wanted to get into his courses. He thought he was doing just fine, thank you. And yet when they tested the students conceptually, it wasn't working. And as conceptual as if you have two balls, one which is twice as heavy as the other, and you drop them from the second-story building, which one reaches the bottom of the ground first? Physics students could answer the formula, but they didn't have the concept. And he did some tests of this, thousands of students, which was a similar test was done in Europe as well, and the results were kind of similar. And with that alarm bell in mind, he totally shifted his lecturing pedagogy to essentially peer instruction. And so what he did was, he said, well, I'm going to have to rethink my curriculum and divide it up into the concepts, first of all, that I think are important. And then I'm going to have to decide which are the problems that will help to illustrate those particular concepts. He divided his lecture, I don't know how, 200-300 people, into small groups. And he said, well, here's the concept, here's the problem. And then with clickers, he said, what's the answer? The first answer, he was getting a 29% success rate. Then he asked the students in groups of 3 or 4, would you please discuss this problem, see if we can do better? Gave them 10 minutes and said, okay, would you now answer the question after your discussion? Went up to 62%. And at that point, then he could enter the conversation and talk about principles and elaborate on it. And then he moved on to the next problem in his curriculum. What I found interesting about this is that it involved just the turning the thing around in the opposite direction so that the students could experience the problem, work it through, and come on their own accord to an understanding of the concept rather than have been told what it was, which was the lecture method. So that was the purpose of that particular clip. You can listen to it yourself online. This is the graph section of my talk. I'm so excited by this because I don't get to use graphs at all. But this one is a very common one out there in the literature and in the research of student attention. Over, as you'll see, a 50-minute period, and with low attention up to high attention. And you get sort of slight variations, but that's about it. At the beginning of the class, so 5 minutes in, it peaks. And then it starts to slide from there on in. The more difficult the material or the more information load, the steeper the incline in attention. You may wonder what this little blip here is at the end. 5 minutes before the end, something seems to happen. The attention goes up. You get the point. Here's perhaps a better illustration of it. So that the red line is the student attention line. And that blip must be, I better wake up, class at an end, what's next class, or what's on the exam. You can figure out what it is. Interesting enough, this is after Lloyd, he decided to graph the professor's performance as well. And we also have a slide during the lecture, but we don't have a blip at the end. So, and then that leaves you with the question, well, the effectiveness of the lecture can only be as good, I suppose, as they're saying, as the combination of the two. It can never go higher than the professors. That's the idea of the third line. This is the important one. This is kind of a minimum rethink of the lecture, so that if about 23 to 26 minutes into the lecture, I would put it perhaps a little bit earlier, but you have a rest, or what's sometimes called a reset. What happens is that that reset can be just rest, or it can be get up and stretch, or it could be an activity, write something, discuss something, whatever little activity you have in mind. Now, they've graphed this as learning lost. I disagree with that, because I think this activity can also be a learning enhancer at the same time. But be that as it may, even if they're just resting or take a little nap, and you say, well, this is nothing that's happening here, you would have to agree that attention goes up after that rest, and then not as high as it was at the beginning, but you get increased attention. And so if you're concerned about this, you would have to admit, well, you've gained at least all of that attention because of the reset. Well, if one reset is good, why not why not every 10 minutes do a reset? And perhaps you could sustain attention throughout the lecture. Careful. If you repeat the same reset, it goes down again. What does that say? That says we need a tremendous variety. We need a really big toolkit of ways of resetting the lecture if we're going to sustain attention. However, so I have some cautions about the reset, because it perhaps ignores the fact that we might need to think behind the lecture, particularly to learning goals and to the appropriate pedagogies for those goals, whereas just tweaking a lecture with a reset, we might lull ourselves into the comfort that, well, I've tweaked it and I'm good to go. But if that lecture method is not well suited to the learning goals, then I'm not sure the effectiveness is going to be there. Weiman is an interesting case. Another physicist, I don't know why the physicists got at this, so good for them, I guess. But he's at, I think, people in the room might know better than I do. I think UBC may have poached him. They may have poached him. He also has a part-time appointment at the University of Colorado. Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and brought to UBC. And what he discovered, he had a very profound interest in science education, which is, I think, part of his mission, is that he really wants to change science education. And what he found was when the students, physics graduates, were into his lab, like Mazur in, I think, Maryland, he was very disappointed in the quality of his students. He said they really weren't very good as researchers in his lab. And then he noticed that it took them about 3-4 months. And he said, suddenly they became very good. And he wasn't just priding himself and said, well, under my guidance, they suddenly were transformed into sort of brilliant physicists. What he noticed, of course, that because they were learning experiment design, they were encountering problems, they were talking with him, they were discussing issues, doing analysis, because they were participating and being active in the business of science, their science thinking improved very rapidly. And he said, well, if it's good enough for grad students, why can't we push that down into the undergraduate program? There must be a way. And like Mazur, then he also transformed his lecture class into a much more participatory one. People learn by creating their own understanding. Effective teaching facilitates that creation by getting students engaged in thinking, and so on. My own experience, I'll give it to you this way. I think I would argue that lecturing is perhaps of an indulgence, perhaps even an addiction. So with that metaphor in mind, I'm going to give you, try and come clean here with a little bit of therapy. It's almost a prose poem, but it's not quite. So this is my title. Hello, my name is Brent, and I'm a lecturer. In my lectures, I have assigned a textbook chapter and then more or less summarized it all for my students. I have seen students droop in their seats, wilting under the early morning heat of my late night insights. I have ignored them and soldiered on, hoping against hope that the sheer force of my eloquence would awaken them to the clear ringing bells of truth. But I have also caught the beautiful eyes of 5 interested students in a class of 80 and soared upwards, buoyed by the compliment of their rapt attention. I have interrupted my lecture to ask a trenchant, probing question and waited patiently for an answer. I have learned to grow comfortable with that silence, for I know that a wise lecturer will give his or her students time, count to 10, to formulate their thoughts. And I have ended up answering the question myself anyway. I have crammed interesting background facts and information from online sources minutes before class, and then spent lecture time telling students what I found. I have known the out-of-body experience while lecturing and have longed to leave permanently the cozy home of my own droning voice. I have tried to use the laser power of my stare to shut down cell phones, close laptops, and halt in its tracks, the flirtatious post-party chat. I have run out of time, and so have spoken louder and faster, pleading for 4 more minutes while I hit just the highlights from the last 2 chapters. I have tried to cover all of the material. I've left a lecture chin up pleased with my own energized performance, and then paused 10 steps down the corridor to wonder, what have I got for tomorrow? There's room in the slide for some bullets. Would anyone care to witness? I wasn't sure I'd get anything, but that's all right. Lecture struggles to facilitate deep learning, meaning-making, and attitudinal change. Has limited effectiveness for retention. Has limited power to teach conceptual thinking. Relies on deliver and accept rather than create and offer. It jackhammers motivation, the bedrock of all learning. Does not advance professionalism. This is Weiman. There's a problem with that. Creates the illusion that telling is learning. What to do? From my point of view, I think that we have to tip it around and that active learning is a natural ally of student engagement. Technology can help, sure. Any of it and all of it, whatever works. Right? But it is never sufficient in itself, and it should never be confused with engagement. Curricular goals in classroom management should aim at learning as a personal investment. A couple more. Campus support systems, I have in mind all the student services, a vibrant campus life, and all of those kinds of things. Yes, very important for sure to help with learning. Institutional support, and I think that's from things like our tenure and promotion and the systems that we have in place for our professional lives. Hiring committees. How brave are your hiring committees on the subject of a teacher who can engage students? It's an issue that we could talk about. And I think most importantly, I'll end with this, that what would help most, I think, with student engagement is if we have a culture of informed. And I think that's important because what this little bit of research told me is that there is a lot of excellent research and information out there, which, and in a way, I'm surprised that we need to know more of it. We're academics. We proceed by evidence. We proceed by logic. That this is our livelihood, and so I think we need to put our teaching where our mouth is. If there's good research and good evidence out there, we need to look seriously at what those scholars and professionals are telling us. And so that we'll have a reflective pedagogy and a supportive community. I think all of that can go into improving student engagement. And so I think we need to open up the conversation here at this point for discussion.
You engaged me because I was supposed to leave 15 minutes ago, but I haven't done so. But I am going to leave right now. I'm going to turn it over to Don here to handle the questions and the dialogue that will follow. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. I want to go back to that list of the professions. I'll tell you mine. New professor at University of St. John doing a graduate honor seminar. I had two texts that I was trying to decide between that I would use for the class, both by the same author. Chose one, bookstore orders it, students go buy it. The students are all told to prepare the first chapter of the seminar. I go in, asking questions about it, asking about this, they're not engaged at all. And I'm thinking, they haven't read it. And what about this? Blank. What about that? Blank. And suddenly notice I have the wrong text. They have the right one, I have the wrong one. I read the wrong chapter. Of course they have no idea what I'm talking about. So then very quickly go get the new chapter, quickly read it, try to get something together, come back in. Never told them, by the way. You have to read more carefully next time.
That's a great bullet.
So, questions for Brent? I'll let you feel this anyway.
Brent, one of the things about my teaching is I haven't taught a class under 120 students in years. And really, I'm not looking so much, the cutoff between your placing a lecture or something else, or just for making a lecture more effective, which is really what I'm trying to do. But when you've got classes that large and something much larger, what realistically do you have other than a lecture?
Well, and again, I'm sorry we didn't have the audio because Mazur has done it. I mean, that's a class of, I think, larger than yours. And he doesn't lecture. He works with dialogue and conversation of groups of students and problems and a conversation in that large class. Larry Michelson at the university, where is he now? University of Oklahoma. Who was one of the originators of team-based learning, which I use, in his business classes, I think he has well over 100 students, and he uses learning teams there. I don't, for a minute, sort of claim that this is not a challenge. It really is. And I think that's perhaps part of the problem is that it requires a lot of thinking, requires some research and help, on our part to make any kind of radical pedagogical change to what we've been doing. But all I'll say is that there's a whole whack of active learning strategies out there, from problem-based learning to inquiry-based learning to team-based learning, peer instruction, case studies, and on and on and on. Some very bright, creative, and energetic people who find ways to make it better than the monological approach. And I would say that many of these active learning techniques, they're on a scale. Some are very low risk and very simple. A simple reset button is one thing, to a much more radical rethinking of an entire course structure. So there are options. There are options. Yeah, Brian?
Just wanted to respond to that. I'll be doing the next lecture in this series on engagement in March. And it'll follow up in some ways what we're talking about here, because what I'll be talking about is the modified lecture. Kind of a way for those of us who just can't get rid of lectures to save the lecture and do an approach which involves active learning. And some of the resets that Brent MacLaine here would be actual active learning activities that have pedagogical implications and so on. So that'll be coming up towards the end of March. I'll be talking about that, and that'll be, and it'll be focused more on the low risk things than the complete overhaul into problem-based learning or so on. So,
might not things be worse than you're presenting? I notice most of the research is sort of based on students 20, 30 years ago. As we move through with Generation X, Generation Y, millenniums, shorter attention spans, might not some of those graphs in those times actually be shortened more for the students we have now, rather than the ones that were part of that research?
It's quite possibly. Now, a little bit misleading that the original graphs were very early on, but the work by Starkley and the most recent book by Taking Stock by Joy Mighty and Julian and Christensen Hughes, there's some very up-to-date research which the graphs I don't think change very much.
We hear about a shortening attention span, that's not being backed up by evidence?
I think that I don't think that the shortened attention span of students. I don't know that we have the evidence to change the graph. I think what may be, I thought you were going to say what a more interesting question is, am I preaching to the choir here? And that, this may be a room full of people who have long since moved on from this stuff and have wonderfully active classrooms and are not relying on the lectures. I mean, that's the real question. And I didn't have time to mention that, but where are we at UPEI? How much does UPEI as an educational institution rely on the lecture as a delivery mode for our students? I did a lot. I did some informal polling, a couple of the students. Interesting. A graduate student, very bright. In fact, he had a double major, a major in chemistry and a major in English. And I said, Rob, just on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being all talk, dialogue, conversation, seminar, and 10 being uninterrupted lecture, where would you place your experience at UPEI? He said, well, it's different for my 2 degrees. He said it was 4 for his arts degree, 7 for his science degree. And he said it would also be different from his first 2 years to his last 2 years. He's a very bright guy. He said it would be 7 for his first 2 years. I asked a second student just before I came here, and I got a similar response. Right. So I think that's research we could do at UPEI. Julie?
I was interested when you were talking about moving top down from the way graduate school deals with students, because I come from a preschool environment, and there the graph is exactly how we're taught to deal with a classroom. Never more than 10 minutes on any one activity. It's just the way it works. So I wonder if there's any change in students' attention spans, or if perhaps they have simply lost the ability to mask that they had lost attention.
Well, I don't see. I don't think the problem is with the student attention. I think it's interesting that when we invite very young children to learn, we have these activities and they participate in their learning. We're comfortable with that. When we have graduate students, we're comfortable with them participating, doing things, and solving problems. What is it about this middle section that we're so uncomfortable about giving them things to do, to learn? And I don't know. Sometimes I think of it just very personally. I thought of asking you. I said, well, how do you learn? You're still learning, right? How are you learning? And how many lectures have you listened to in the past 5 years? Okay, we go to conference, we listen to a conference paper. But most of your learning does not take place with lectures, right? Well, if it's good enough for us, why isn't it good enough for our students? Why can't we? So there seems to be some kind of mismatch, or I think we're a little bit stuck in that. Ron.
Do you think there's a place for scaffolding students into the position where they can participate in conversations more meaningfully about text, for example? Because I often find that the allow students to begin to speak immediately. They wander a bit in and out, and that there's a certain threshold or something familiar with text and problems around the text that help them to make that conversation, participate in that conversation meaningfully more fully. And that just cast them out there.
No, absolutely. And I mean, one of the definitions of Weiman, for instance, is very clear about guided, right? Is that the guidance is very, look, I'm no fan of group work for the sake of group work. Group work can be miserable experience. It has to be a very highly managed and very, very carefully designed classroom strategy. And to throw out a text and say, okay, you people discuss, no, that's a failure. So I agree with you in that our role, first of all, is to ensure preparation and acquaintance with the text, the experiment or whatever. But then what we can do, rather than tell them, we can put questions, we can put problems, we can put issues and say, okay, what can you come up with? And then we can sort of say, okay, now we're going to go to the next step. So I think that's our role, yes, is to deepen the learning and to set a high standard, absolutely. But we can do that with other methods other than the lecture, absolutely.
We seem to have the lecture as one person standing up and delivering. Is there any model about having two people debating, discussing? Because I think some of our students in the way or something listening to two professors argue over some of the things that they argue about. It's probably a more learning experience than one person. Should we move that into a classroom or more formal setting?
You could try. I think Graham Gibbs addresses that one. I think the jury is probably out on it. I mean, if you want to model a debate, I think if it's sort of highly structured, I think that could be interesting. But I think there are some sides to that if to team teaching, for instance, has its issues that you're just getting, particularly if it's not. If the curricular goals are not highly sort of scripted and agreed upon, you're just getting one and another, some and more, and it may not be any more effective. But I don't know the research on it. I'm sorry.
Motivation. How much do you think the students' motivation impacts on their ability to be efficient learners. And I'm wondering, you know, are we getting students who are prepared to learn, who are here and engaged in the topic because they're motivated to be? It seems to me there's a side of that equation that's very difficult to influence. If they're showing up because, you know, they're trying to put another 4 years before they have to get into the real world, quote unquote, then you know, it really goes against what you can hope to achieve in any kind of learning environment. And I don't know how much that enters into it or what we can hope to do with that.
Well, there are a lot of complex things there, and I don't pretend to be able to address all of those, Larry. But I mean, in terms of preparedness for university work, then that's a whole other issue. Except that I would say one of the principles that I hold dear in terms of engagement, I guess, with students, and it's a principle which I learned as an undergraduate at this university in the Bachelor of Education program, and that is that learning, you have to move from what is known to the unknown. And that you defeat your purpose if you decide, well, the students are unprepared, I'm going to start here. And it's a high standard, and they'll reach it somehow. But if we don't meet the students and acknowledge where they are and work with the motivation and the curriculum design to sort of move them forward by steps, then I don't think we will succeed. The other piece I think that's implied in your question, however, though, is also a kind of just that's the overarching preparation, but there's also immediate preparation for classroom work. And that's a real hazard for the lecture. That I could have added half a dozen more bullets. But for you to start lecturing on material which students have not read, I think that's deadly. That's just deadly. And that's one of the things, again, that an active learning environment can solve. With my team-based learning strategies, I have students who are much better prepared for the class to encounter the material. And the result is also I get much better discussion in the class. You can't discuss something if you haven't read it. You know that. And I get better attendance. Right? I was looking for a sign or an image after hypocrisy of self-righteousness, but I couldn't find one. But
Do you have a resource or two that you direct us towards to promote active learning at this level?
Just found one. I just found a really good one. Barclay's Student Engagement Techniques, a guide for college instructors, 2010, pay dirt. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, I'm Josh McFadden. I don't even remember, but I took a course from you probably 10 or 11 years ago. I'm not going to.
Time is up, isn't it?
But I'm going to add something, maybe another whimsical bullet to your list of what you've done in class. And I just think it's maybe a good lesson for all of us. That in one class you were teaching E.M. Forster's Passage to India. And actually there was a part, and I don't remember the character's name or exactly the whole context, but the character was an Indian who sang a song that ended on a 7, I think. And that clashed with everybody's sensibilities who was not from India. And you actually sang a song for us and demonstrated this, and I think, I'm not going to ask you to do it now, but and that stuck with me for the last 11 years, like nothing else from the course ever has, so I think that stepping out, and I guess for all of us stepping out of your comfort zone and doing something that wouldn't exactly fit with classroom norms is really effective, because I don't remember the character's name or anything about it other than
God believe.
Okay, that's right. Other than the point, which was that was an Indian approach to a.
Well, me singing a 7th in class, I can see why that would stick with you. I mean, I see that. That's right. That's right. Yes.
Well, this was a question, I guess, follow up what Josh was saying, is that I think, there was, when you were running through your list of potential definitions for engagement, and I think what a lot of this discussion is highlighting is two of them, which is risk and investment. And so the risk is, okay, it might fail, and you're going to get out of your comfort zone, and things are going to get out of control, and then the content doesn't get covered, and that is very important for, particularly for some disciplines. But also the investment. I mean, Larry, you're saying, well, okay, we're asking for resources, and it takes a lot of time to take apart a course and rejig it, and even if you're going to take small steps and some low-risk activities. And so we get back to our offices, and we're all jazzed up about this, and then how many of us are going to... we're not dusting off lecture notes, it's not that pathetic, but you know, how much of us are really going to take those big risks? And so things like institutional investment come in there, so that it's legitimate to spend a sizable chunk of a sabbatical, you know, exploring those things in ways that you can demonstrate and that are constructive, and then also perhaps measured. Because I think, as some of our discussions in the Faculty of Arts have pointed out, that maybe we're dealing with some myths about the student engagement that happens at a small university, the myths of small classroom size, the myths of our commitment to creative teaching. And if we honestly examine that, then that raises questions about what kind of institutional investments are necessary to make that happen.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I mean, it was implied in my fast bullets at the end, but in terms of institutional support, I was at Steli in Saskatoon in the spring, and I, you know, one of the observations I had was that there's a whole younger generation of educational developers who are coming on stream now, and they are terrific. They know this literature, they know this research, they know how all of this stuff works, and they can help us, right? But we have to have the institutional will to bring these people with us. And yes, I mean, we need the workshops, the conferences, the sabbatical support, you know, retooling a course. There's a program that does, I think it's out west somewhere, where you sign up for a week, and it's essentially boot camp for course design, right? You bring all your materials with you, your textbooks, and you sit down with people who know what they're doing, and say, okay, what are you going to do with this course? How are you going to do it? So there are a lot of options out there, and really good programs.
I'm probably going to bounce on what Blair said, but you mostly used the word pedagogy in your presentation. Do you think
the word what, I'm sorry?
Pedagogy.
Yes.
Pedagogy.
Sorry, I'm French. So do you think that actually the challenge with the undergraduate comes from the fact that we're at a point where actually it's more, we would hope that we're more doing andragogy than pedagogy, and actually it's kind of a switch in between, and that actually involved, you know, the amount of motivation in the people you're trying to teach?
I'm sorry, I missed a key component to your question, which was this or that?
Yeah.
Andragogy, like, so teaching children as opposed to teaching adults.
Thanks.
And so you're wondering if we're doing one of the other?
Too much pedagogy, none of that. Too much taking with children, none of taking with adults.
I don't have those categories in my approach to the classroom when I go in. I look at them as people and as students, and I'm interested in them, and I try to figure out where they are and how I can help. For me, teaching is a helping profession. That's what turns my crank. I really like helping people progress. I like to see them succeed. And so the curriculum, the course material, I mean, right now I'm teaching an introductory course, 35 students, Introduction to Poetry. Non-required course. There's students from all the University of Business Science and all over the place. And and you sort of think, well, how's that going to go down, you know? And I realized that for some of these students, they're very anxious. And I think, well, my goal here is to take these young adults, or their attitudes, and sort of think, well, I want to make them comfortable with poetry. I want to give them that little bit of pleasure that they can take with them from this class for the rest of their lives, so that they're not going to be afraid if they pick up a poem and say, well, I don't read poetry, or I can't understand this. If I can give them some skills and some appreciation just for one or two poems in the rest of their lives, then I will feel that I've succeeded in that. But I don't think in terms of sort of a categories for them. I think I'm sort of very concentrated on trying to figure out where they are and what they need to know to move forward. So I don't think that's a very good answer to your question, but it's the best I can do.
I want to thank Brent for this.
Yeah. Thank you.